14 billion credits. That was the discrepancy. Not a rounding error, not a misplaced decimal. 14 billion credits had evaporated from the Kepler 442b terraforming ledger across 19 months. The Helios Reclamation Corporation flagged it as probable embezzlement. They sent their most meticulous auditor. Her name was Maren Voss, and she had never left Earth's orbit before. She packed thermal socks, a spreadsheet partition, and a photograph of her daughter. She did not pack a weapon. The shuttle touched down at Station Erebus in a howl of displaced dust. Kepler 442b was brown. That was Maren's first impression. Not the red-brown of Mars tourism posters or the golden brown of autumn, the brown of dead nothing stretching to every horizon. The terraforming was in Phase 3, supposedly. Atmospheric seeding, mineral redistribution, hydrological mapping. The numbers said progress. But Maren trusted numbers, and the numbers here were lying. Station Director Combe Bryce met her at the airlock with coffee that tasted like engine coolant. He smiled too wide. Financial audit, during a terraforming window. Unusual. Maren opened her tablet. 14 billion credits, unusual. Bryce's smile dimmed by exactly 1 degree. He gave her access to Level 2 records. She'd requested Level 4. He said Level 4 was corrupted in a server storm. Maren noted that server storms don't selectively target accounting databases. Her quarters were a converted storage pod, 7 meters square. Through the porthole, she could see the primary terraforming array, a cathedral of pipes and condensers standing 40 stories high, bleeding white vapor into the thin sky. It should have been running at 80% capacity. The power draw suggested 12. Maren cross-referenced the energy logs against the materials requisition forms. Someone was ordering supplies for a machine that was barely operational. Day 2, she interviewed the supply chain manager, a tired woman named Petrov who rubbed her temples and said all the right things in all the wrong order. Costs go up. Alien terrain, transport delays, unexpected geological complications. Maren asked what geological complications. Petrov hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, Maren counted, and said soil inconsistencies. Nobody in corporate history had spent 14 billion credits on soil inconsistencies. Maren requested field access. Petrov said she'd need approval. Approval came from Bryce's office 40 minutes later, surprisingly fast. But the field access was limited to Sector 9, the showcase sector, where they brought investor delegations. Maren had seen the satellite imagery. Sector 9 was the only zone where terraforming appeared to match the reported timeline. Every other sector was behind schedule by years. She accepted the access pass and immediately began planning how to reach Sector 12, where the largest budget overruns had been logged. Geologist assigned as her field escort was a lanky man named Ewan. He talked constantly, which Maren found useful. People who talk constantly eventually say something true by accident. On the transport crawler to Sector 9, Ewan mentioned that 3 survey teams had cleared Kepler 442b before terraforming began. Standard protocol. Geological, biological, atmospheric, all came back clean. He paused. Well, almost clean. Maren looked up from her tablet. Almost. Ewan changed the subject. Sector 9 was impressive. The soil had been turned and enriched, showing the first green patches of engineered moss spreading across the mineral-rich substrate. Moisture collectors hummed in neat rows. Everything matched the budget reports, but Maren wasn't looking at the moss. She was looking at the ground between installations where the original surface was still exposed. She knelt down. The soil had a strange texture, tiny regular indentations, almost like a pattern. She photographed them. Ewan told her it was natural crystallization. That night, Maren enlarged the photographs on her tablet until the pixels blurred. The indentations weren't random. They formed grids, intersecting lines at precise angles, with slight variations that suggested organic rather than geological process. She measured the spacing. Each grid unit was approximately 0.4 millimeters. She ran the image through a pattern recognition algorithm designed for detecting fraud in printed documents. The algorithm returned a confidence score of 94.7%. The pattern was artificial. Maren didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her cot and stared at the image and thought about what it meant if the soil patterns on a certified uninhabited planet were artificial. She thought about the 3 survey teams that had walked these plains and signed clearance forms. She thought about 14 billion missing credits. And she thought about the word Ewan had almost used before catching himself. Almost clean. She needed a microscope. The station lab had one. She requested lab access at 0600. By 0614, Bryce was at her door. A microscope? For financial audit. Maren showed him nothing. Material verification. I need to confirm the substrate composition matches what was invoiced. It was plausible enough. Bryce granted access but assigned a lab technician to supervise. The technician's name was Auditor, and she had the careful eyes of someone who had already seen something she wasn't supposed to discuss. Maren placed her soil sample under magnification. At 10x, the grid pattern became clearer. At 50x, the intersections showed raised structures. At 200x, Maren stopped breathing. The raised structures were buildings, not geological formations, not crystalline deposits, buildings, with walls and openings and what appeared to be connecting pathways between them. Each structure was no larger than a grain of sand. Auditor leaned in, looked through the eyepiece, and quietly said, "You need to see Sector 12. The lab door was locked from outside." Auditor checked, came back, and spoke in a voice stripped of pretense. 17 of us know, we've known for 9 months. Maren's hands were shaking. She gripped the lab bench to stop them. 9 months, and you kept terraforming. No, Auditor said, that's where the money went. We stopped. Almost everything stopped. Bryce has been falsifying the progress reports while we figured out what to do. Discrepancy. It's the cost of not terraforming. Maren sat down heavily on a lab stool. The 14 billion credits hadn't been stolen. They'd been spent maintaining the illusion that work was progressing, running equipment at low power to generate believable heat signatures, ordering materials that sat untouched in warehouses, paying crews full salaries to do almost nothing. All because 17 people on an alien world had looked through a microscope and made a choice that could end their careers, their freedom, possibly their lives. "Show me," Maren said. The crawler to Sector 12 left at midnight, running without headlights. Auditor drove. Ewan sat in the back, no longer talking. They reached the sector boundary at 0200 and switched to foot travel. Auditor handed Maren a pair of modified survey goggles. The lenses had been replaced with magnification arrays that could resolve detail at sub-millimeter scale. "Walk slowly," Auditor said. "Watch where you step." Maren activated the goggles and looked down. The ground came alive, cities everywhere, stretching across the plains in patterns that mirrored the aerial fractal geometry of river deltas. Structures so small that a human fingertip could obliterate a neighborhood. Filaments of light, actual light, impossibly faint, ran between clusters, forming networks that pulsed with rhythmic intensity. Transportation systems, maybe, or communication lines. Maren dropped to her knees and held the goggles steady. In the nearest cluster, something was moving. Thousands of somethings. Living beings going about their existence. They were smaller than ants, smaller than mites. Their bodies caught the starlight in iridescent flickers, and they moved with purpose along the filament paths, congregating at junctions, entering and exiting structures. Maren counted 6 distinct architectural styles within a single square centimeter. Different districts, different cultures, maybe. She looked up at Auditor, who was standing perfectly still, arms at her sides, watching Maren's face. "The first survey team," Maren whispered. "They walked through this. Yes, probably killed millions." Maren removed the goggles and sat in the dark, breathing. The wind moved across the plains, carrying that might contain fragments of structures, bodies, history. She thought about the terraforming protocol. Phase 3 involved injecting engineered bacteria into the soil to alter its mineral composition. It would be, for the beings below her, the equivalent of someone filling Earth's atmosphere with acid. Not a war. Not even a catastrophe. An extinction so total that no one would know to mourn it. Back at the station, Auditor showed her what the 17 had built in secret. A converted storage bay behind the water treatment plant, filled with improvised research equipment. Microscopes bolted to vibration-dampened tables. Image captures running through translation algorithms. Electromagnetic sensors tuned to frequencies so low they barely registered on standard instruments. 9 months of painstaking work, all funded through creative accounting. "We've been trying to communicate," Auditor said. "We haven't succeeded, but we've learned things." The beings, the team called them the Kith, from an Old English word meaning known people, had an electromagnetic signature. Faint, structured, rhythmic, not radio, something closer to coordinated bioluminescence, but operating in wavelengths humans couldn't see without instruments. Auditor played a recording. The visualizer showed cascading patterns of color, dense with information. "It's language," said Ewan, who turned out to have a doctorate in xenolinguistics he'd never listed on his terraforming application. "Complex language. We just can't read it." Maren stared at the patterns cycling on the screen. "What happens when Helios finds out you stop terraforming?" Auditor's jaw tightened. Contract termination, criminal charges for the budget manipulation. "Bryce takes the fall," he insisted. "The rest of us get blacklisted from colonial work." She paused, "and then they send a new team that doesn't know or doesn't care." That was the trap. The 17 had bought time with fraud, and now the auditor they'd been hiding from was their only possible ally. Maren spent 3 days reviewing Helios Corporation's terraforming charter. She found what she expected: a standard uninhabited world clause granting action and modification rights contingent on confirmed biological clearance. 3 survey teams had signed those clearances. The kith didn't register on any standard biological scanner because they were too small, their electromagnetic output too faint, their structures too easily mistaken for mineral deposits. They had been invisible in exactly the way the surveys were designed to detect. The clearances were valid and wrong. She filed a preliminary audit report to Helios headquarters via quantum relay. It confirmed financial irregularities. It requested a 60-day extension for full investigation. It said nothing about the kith. Marin needed time, and the only currency she had was bureaucratic process. Helios granted 45 days. The clock started. Somewhere beneath her feet, across thousands of kilometers of surface, a civilization continued its existence, unaware that its survival now depended on an accountant's ability to build an airtight case. Day 12, Ewan made a breakthrough. The kith's electromagnetic language operated in recursive loops, phrases that folded back on themselves, carrying context from previous exchanges. It wasn't linear communication. It was something closer to music, where meaning accumulated through variation on themes. He couldn't translate it, but he could identify emotional registers. Certain patterns appeared when the kith congregated in large groups. Others emerged during what seemed to be construction. And one pattern, sharp, discordant, repeating, appeared only near the sectors where terraforming had already begun. Fear, the discordant pattern, was fear. Marin listened to the recording 6 times, and each time it cut deeper. The kith in the affected sectors had been broadcasting distress since the first atmospheric injection, 16 months ago. Their signals had grown louder, more complex, more desperate. They were screaming in a frequency no human had been listening for. And the terraforming equipment had continued its work, oblivious. For 7 months before Auditor found the first city, and the 17 made their impossible choice. Marin asked the question one wanted to answer. How many did we kill? Auditor pulled up the population density estimates. In the sectors where Phase 3 had operated at full capacity, sectors 1 through 8, the kith's electromagnetic signatures had dropped to near zero. The cities were still visible under magnification, but nothing moved in them. The light filaments were dark. Auditor's voice was clinical, which Marin recognized as the sound of someone holding themselves together by vocabulary alone. Conservative estimate, 4 billion, maybe more. Marin went outside alone. The station lights fell behind her and the alien sky opened up, unfamiliar constellations, no moon, just the deep permanent twilight of a world orbiting a dim star. She stood on ground that was a graveyard and a living world simultaneously. 4 billion, a number she understood. Earth had held 4 billion people once in the century before interstellar travel. She thought of her daughter, who was 8, who collected rocks, who would grow up in a civilization capable of this kind of accidental atrocity. Day 20. Marin began building 2 documents simultaneously. The first was the official audit report, a meticulous accounting of every diverted credit, every falsified progress metric, every lie Bryce had told to protect a species he couldn't speak to. It would destroy him. The second document was different. It was a legal brief arguing that Kepler 442b's biological clearance was invalid, that the kith constituted a sapient civilization under the interstellar compact's definition, and that Helios had an obligation to cease operations immediately. This document would destroy the company. The compact defined sapience through 5 criteria: tool use, environmental modification, symbolic communication, social organization, and temporal planning. Marin needed evidence for all 5. Tool use was visible under magnification, the kith-shaped materials for construction. Environmental modification was obvious in their city structures. Social organization was demonstrated by the patterns and apparent districts. Symbolic communication was Ewan's recordings. Temporal planning was the hardest. She needed to prove the kith could think about the future. And then Auditor found the monuments. In Sector 12, at the boundary between living cities and the dead zones left by terraforming, the kith had built new structures unlike anything else on the planet. Tall for their scale, nearly 2 millimeters high, they were arranged in precise rows facing the dead sectors. Auditor's imaging showed they contained no interior spaces. They weren't functional. They were memorials. The kith were mourning their dead, and they had built the monuments facing the direction the destruction had come from. They knew. They understood cause and effect. They were planning for what might come next. Day 31. Marin's time was running out. She had the evidence, but evidence meant nothing without jurisdiction. Helios Corporation operated under colonial charter law, which favored commercial development. The interstellar compact's sapience protections had never been tested against a corporation this large. If she filed the brief and lost, the precedent would make it harder to protect every future discovery. If she filed the audit report alone, Bryce went to prison and the kith died anyway. She needed a third option. It came from Ewan at 0300 in the hidden lab. He'd been running the Kith's electromagnetic signals through a new filter, one designed to detect mathematical structures rather than linguistic ones. The results were extraordinary. The Kith's communication wasn't just language. Embedded in every exchange was a mathematical substrate, constants, ratios, geometric relationships. They were doing mathematics as naturally as breathing, and some of the mathematics was advanced, startlingly advanced. Topology, nonlinear dynamics, structures that human mathematicians had only theorized about. Marin looked at the mathematical analysis for a long time. This isn't just proof of sapience, she said slowly. This is proof of value. Ewan flinched at the word, and Marin understood why, and she hated herself for thinking it. But she was an auditor. She knew how corporations made decisions. Sapience was a legal argument that could be fought in court for decades. But a civilization that had independently developed mathematics beyond human capability, that was intellectual property. That was worth more than terraforming. That changed the equation. She rewrote the brief overnight. Not as a moral argument, not as a legal challenge, as a business case. The Kith's mathematical insights, if they could ever be translated and applied, represented potential breakthroughs in fields from materials science to quantum computing. The value of those discoveries dwarfed the revenue from one terraformed planet. Helios wouldn't stop because it was right. Helios would stop because the Kith alive were worth more than the Kith dead. Marin had never felt so dirty and so certain. Day 43, 2 days past her deadline. Helios was sending messages. Marin transmitted 3 documents simultaneously. The audit report explaining the financial discrepancy, the Sapience brief with full evidence, and the business case projecting the Kith's potential value. She sent copies to Helios, to the Interstellar Compact, and to 17 different news organizations. Then she walked to Bryce's office and told him what she'd done. He sat behind his desk for a very long time. Then he said, "Thank you." Then he said, "I'm sorry it took money to make them listen." The response took 11 days. It came not from Helios's legal department, but from the CEO herself, via priority quantum relay. Terraforming operations were suspended pending review. A xenobiological assessment team was being dispatched. Helios was forming a Kith research division. The stock price had risen 14% on the announcement. Marin read the message twice and felt something complicated, relief braided with revulsion. She had saved the Kith by making them a commodity. The question was whether she could make them something more before the corporations decided what they were worth. Before the assessment team arrived, Marin went back to Sector 12 one last time. She wore the magnification goggles and walked with exaggerated care to the memorial site at the edge of the dead zone. The monument still stood, tiny and resolute, facing the devastation. But something had changed. New structures were being built beside the memorials. Not monuments, these were different. Open frameworks oriented upward, like platforms or stages. As Marin watched, Kith gathered on them in organized formations and began to pulse with light. They were trying to be seen. Marin understood it with a certainty that bypassed logic and went straight to her chest. The Kith had noticed that the destruction stopped. They had noticed the vibrations of human footsteps that came and lingered instead of passing through. They had built stages, amplification structures, and were projecting their signals upward toward whatever enormous beings had finally paused above their world. They didn't know what humans were. They didn't know if humans could perceive them. They were broadcasting anyway. Hope, it turned out, scaled down perfectly. Marin knelt in the dust of Kepler 442b, careful not to disturb the ground, and held very still. Below her, a civilization of beings too small to see with naked eyes was reaching upward with everything they had. She couldn't hear them. She couldn't speak to them. She had no way to tell them that she saw them, that they mattered, that an accountant from a world they couldn't imagine had fought for them with spreadsheets and business projections, because the universe hadn't provided her with anything better. She placed her palm flat on the ground beside the memorial district, gently, the faintest pressure she could manage, and she held it there, a human hand the size of a continent to the Kith, warm and still and deliberate. She didn't know if they could feel it. She didn't know if they would understand. But Ewan told her later, when he reviewed the electromagnetic recordings from that moment, that every Kith signal within a kilometer radius shifted simultaneously into a pattern they had never recorded before. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the mathematics. It was something new, something that didn't translate yet. He said it repeated over and over for hours after she left. Marin chose to believe it meant what she hoped it meant. She chose to believe it meant, "We know you're there."